hyper-reality, aka Jean Baudrillard's fucked up mind about how he thinks the world works. These are all extremely relevant historical and pop culture phenomenon that Jean Baudrillard talks about. Or obviously he didn't talk about Obama and Trump, but like most of these things Baudrillard talks about, and it's good to know your history. So I just put these there. All right. So before we begin, we're gonna play an activity. We're gonna do the Price is Right. So in the L2 questions, can someone guess how much this Supreme t-shirt is worth? Okay, so we have a lot of guesses. All right, how much is this Supreme t-shirt worth? Okay, so the first t-shirt was worth $700. This one is worth 20. Okay, continuing on. Which one of these is art? One of these was drawn by a child, and the other one was drawn by a professional modern artist. Okay, so most of you were correct. The left is the child, and the right is the professional modern artist. Okay, which one of these is the real Obama? One of these is fake, the other one's real. Okay, so I guess some of you were correct. The right one is the real Obama. The left one is a deep fake created by Jordan Peele in 2018, imitating President Obama. And if you don't know what deep fake is this kind of like Photoshoppy thing that a lot of hackers are using to imitate politicians. So they create like very realistic images of people like President Obama. And Jordan Peele, the comedian, was able to just use a deep fake to show the dangers of deep fake. So this is going to be relevant. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, I want to talk about traditional capitalism. So under traditional capitalism, Karl Marx posits this theory called the labor theory of value. He basically thinks that all societies should be interpreted through production, and he actually draws a line between pre-modern societies that weren't organized around production, modern societies, and well, I guess Marx wasn't alive to see the postmodern societies. But basically, he thinks that societies are organized in accumulating as much wealth and production as possible as per the Industrial Revolution. So under the labor theory of value, it's very simple mathematics. If an average Joe was to create a piano for 2 hours and it's worth $100, then if Joe works on that piano for 10 hours, then it should be worth $1,000 because he worked 5 times as harder on the second one. So it shows how the more production value that there is, the more the value is going to be. Likewise, if Joe is twice as much skilled as like Ridfik or someone, then the piano should be worth twice as much because the production value, again, corresponds to the value, right? So Marx also thinks that every single object and commodity that we consume in capitalism has something called a use value and an exchange value, i.e., in the use value is the functional use of the object. For example, we use a toothbrush to brush our teeth, right? We use this laptop to scroll the internet, to do debate, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a certain use value that's associated with the object. But there's also an exchange value, i.e., a toothbrush can be worth like $1, and that dollar can be exchanged with a piece of gum. So capitalism associates certain things with a certain value so that it can be exchanged along the entire market. So that's traditional Karl Marx labor theory of value. So given that labor theory of value says that the more production you have and the more skills that you have in making that object corresponds to a higher level of value, can someone tell me if they think the labor theory of value is outdated in today's society? Okay, does anyone want to speak up and explain why they think the labor theory of value might be outdated or might not be outdated? So yeah, can someone in the chat like briefly explain why labor theory of value might be outdated or might not be outdated? Yeah, I mean, well, Patrick obviously like has the Baudrillard answer because Patrick obviously knows Baudrillard. So Yeah, Riddick too. So the argument for why labor theory of value might be outdated, and this is where Baudrillard actually post-states Marxism, and this is where he criticizes Marx, because Marx lived in a time where things weren't determined by signifiers and things were determined by the value only. But is that really true when Kanye West is able to sell a white t-shirt for $400 when the only difference between the two Supreme t-shirts is that one of them is fake? The other argument could be that market systems still determine value because it still requires markets to produce this kind of thing. If I like spend more making a Ferrari, it'll probably cost more, right? So before we answer that question and go more into the depth, I would like to explain what a sign is. So a sign is basically just a unit of meaning and how we conceptualize the entirety of the world. We obviously the world exists and we need things like language and we need common things between people to try to explain the world and try to communicate with one another. For example, there's a certain tree in reality and in the world, and in natural world it's not actually called a tree, it just exists within the world. But humans, as a method to communicate with one another, attached a signifier upon it that was like, this is a tree. And now the tree is signified, i.e. the signifier denotes some kind of meaning, so that now when we look at a tree, we now all think that it is a tree, and we can all understand that there's this common denominator between humans. Likewise, we use language to describe the entirety of the world. Language itself is a sign. It doesn't actually exist within the natural world, but we use language as a sign to describe the world, and we use language to signify certain things, and as a result, certain things get signified. When I say like Baudrillard is probably high all the time, like that's a signifier because I'm attaching the word high onto Baudrillard, right? So we communicate through the world through signs and signifiers to conceptualize ourselves and to understand ourselves. So under the new labor theory of value, or as Baudrillard postdates the labor theory of value, Baudrillard thinks that objects don't just have a sign value, or objects don't just have a use value and an exchange value anymore, but things now have been upgraded to have a sign value in today's consumer capitalist world. For example, when I buy a Ferrari, I'm not necessarily buying a Ferrari to drive, because obviously like I could buy a different car that's worth like $2 million less to drive to my high school. But why do people buy Ferraris? It's to look freaking rich. It's to like impress other people. It's to distinguish yourselves from other people within society as someone that is higher class, as someone that is better than everyone else. So you're not only just buying the Ferrari for a car, you're buying the Ferrari for what it represents. And a Ferrari obviously represents something like high class, elitism, etc., etc. So you're basically buying the sign. Likewise, when I'm buying a Supreme t-shirt, yeah, exactly, for the clout. When I'm buying a Supreme t-shirt, I'm not just buying a Supreme t-shirt so that like I don't have to go to school shirtless. I'm buying it for the signifier of Supreme, so that I look like a hype piece, so that I can get more girls or whatever like today's stupid consumer capitalist society believes in, right? So it shows how like a lot of capitalism today is not mediated by the use value or the exchange value anymore, but they're represented by the sign value now. And as a result, economics shouldn't be understood through production, but it should be understood through the sign value and what it represents. Yeah, so a lot of things, Aaron, to answer your question, a lot of the things is going to be specifically branding, because branding is obviously a type of signifiers, but this also works in different ways, which I'll get into a little later. So now, this is what people mean when signs start referring to one another, because if you think about fashion trends, what do fashion trends actually refer to in the real world? Can like someone answer this? Like why is like a shirt popular one year and then a shirt isn't popular the next year? Value gets old because society decides it's ugly. Consumerism. Yeah, so these are all really correct. So fashion trends, if you actually think about Karl Marx's labor theory of value, the value of something got referred to an exterior thing, right? It got referred to the amount of production that it took, the amount of skill that it took to make this thing. So it actually represented like something in the real world. But now we live in a consumer society where things don't refer to something exterior. Oh, is the stream not working? Okay, I hope it works for you, Van. But anyways, so things stop referring to an outside production value, but things start referring to each other. Fashion trends don't refer to anything but what people think will be fashionable. So you see how it's kind of self-referential, and i.e. the fashion trends refer to the fashion trends. So bringing this further on, when we stop thinking of production as the reference for capitalism, what does this mean for the wage laborer? Production is not the thing that we're working for anymore, but what is the role of someone who's like working on a farm or working in Apple? They're not meant to produce anything. They're actually just referring back to a set of signifiers and a set of semiotic capitalism. So what are they working for now? What is their role in society? Oh yeah, I could give another example of this. Another example is the stock market. So if you know anything about how the stock market actually functions, the stock market goes up depending on whether people think the stock market will go up. Like literally, like people invest within the stock market if they think the stock market is going to go up, but the only way that the stock market is going to go up is if people invest into the stock market. So you can see that these kind of economic systems almost have a life in itself, in that it's self-sustaining. It refers to itself over and over again. There's other examples of this also. I can give the example of art earlier. The way that art is determined anymore, if you've ever studied art history and you looked at like the Baroque period or the Renaissance period, a lot of the value of art was determined by its beauty, and it was determined by the way that it could accurately encapsulate the real world. And this doesn't really work anymore in today's society, where now anything can be basically considered an art as long as the artist elites determine that it's art. So basically, the way that we determine something as art is by the artist deciding that this is art, and then the artist gets decided by that this is art by producing art itself. So it shows how it's self-referential itself, but it also shows that it doesn't have an exterior reference. Okay, so getting back onto the question, what does this mean for the wage laborer, the capitalist, and the boss? Can someone like theorize what this could potentially mean? Yeah, that's one theory. Okay, so yeah, those are both correct descriptions of what Baudrillard thinks. So in his book Symbolic Exchange and Death, 1976, he theorizes that the role of the laborer is not someone who is supposed to make production anymore or profits anymore, but he thinks that capitalism should be understood as a system of domination. It should be a system of domination between the boss and the worker. We put a sign upon the laborer as a wage laborer so that they can be someone that is dominated, and we put a sign upon the boss so that they can be someone who dominates the other person. Does that make sense? So in this instance, where the only reason why someone is working for something when they're not actually working for something for production is to be signified as someone who is dominated, Baudrillard thinks that resistance is fundamentally dead also, because resistance is necessary for capitalism to sustain itself. Baudrillard thinks that without strikes, without this kind of illusion that capitalism is working as itself, without these kind of worker strikes, capitalism would itself not work anymore because people won't buy into the illusion anymore. So Baudrillard thinks that these kind of forms of liberation and resistance by the workers are actually necessary. Again, what are they working for at this point? They're not working for some kind of like production value, and the boss doesn't care anymore but the boss doesn't care about the wages because the wages just signifies that the laborer is someone to be dominated. So at this point, liberation is fundamentally just recrafting and reinvesting into the system because it gives the illusion that capitalism still exists on a material level instead of a semiotic level. Okay. So I want to delve more into Baudrillard's theory of information. So we have established that capitalism is mediated by a set of signifiers instead of production. It's not referring to anything real in the real world anymore. So I'm not sure how many of you like sports. I'll give you another example later. But every single summer, there's this thing called like free agency where stars like Kawhi Leonard and other like professional athletes can sign with new teams. And this happens every single year. Like this one guy says Kawhi Leonard will sign with the Los Angeles Clippers. This one guy says the Clippers are out. It's between the Lakers and the Raptors. This one says I'm told the Clippers are now in panic mode, etc., etc. So it shows how we live in a society where there's more information than ever. We live in a society where technically there's more knowledge to be gathered than in the rest of the history of the world. But are people smarter than we were in the 90s or in the 80s? And the answer is probably not. Like, this is why Baudrillard thinks that the fundamental nature of information and the accumulation of more and more science is not actually persuasive. Baudrillard thinks that the information is dissuasive. And this is what you'll hear in every single Baudrillard 2NR and 2AR every single time, is that more information doesn't actually tell us anything more about reality, but more information actually makes things more and more confusing. For example, in Twitter, there's tons of information. There's like almost infinite information, but a lot of these things are contradictory. A lot of these things are really like contradictory. So it's impossible to describe what the real actually is when all these things are contradicting each other. And it shows how just saying more things about where Kawhi Leonard is going to go doesn't actually tell us where Kawhi Leonard is going to go. And actually, Kawhi Leonard went to the Lakers. I mean, not the Lakers, the Clippers. Kawhi Leonard, so like Chris Broussard was wrong when he said Clippers are out. Okay, this is another example, and this is an example in the classic R troop and debris evidence that every single Baudrillard debater wins. Oh, what do I mean by dissuasive? So dissuasive means that like it doesn't actually tell us anything about reality. It just mystifies the reality. When there's more information about where Kawhi Leonard could potentially go, it doesn't actually tell us reality of where he would go, but it actually just mystifies the reality. Because there's just so many contradictory claims, it's impossible to tell what the truth is. So another example is, sure, I mean, that's a counter argument, which I'll go into later. But another example, which is actually given in the R trip and debris evidence that every single Baudrillard 2NR reads, is the example of post-Boston bombing. So in 2014, obviously or 2015, one of those years, there's obviously a horrible atrocity where two people ignited a bomb in Boston Marathon. And right away on Twitter, people started endlessly speculating about the Boston bombing. Like this guy named Jack Moore was like, one of the suspects is Sunil Tripathi. This guy says that's, well, they said the same thing, but the point is that there was endless speculation about who the suspects could be, what their motives would be. People were posting about like, is this ISIS? This isn't ISIS. And like, it was impossible to locate the real truth because there's so much information that was fundamentally contradictory to each other that it was just impossible to determine what the motives of these people actually were. So when we invented the internet, we thought that more information would help us grasp and illuminate reality. But again, it shows the dissuasive nature of information and the overaccumulation of science. Another example is, I don't know if y'all remember the day before the September-October topic on LD last year. There was this rumor that like, I first saw it from like Lucas Krauss that the September-October topic was going to be standardized testing, and all of us just started groaning But then like there are rumors that the standardized testing was completely fake. Like that rumor was just like people were saying like the people who are posting about the standardized testing are completely lying, etc., etc. This went on for like 5 hours, right? So no one could determine whether like we're actually going to have the standardized testing topic or not. And then Lord and behold, we did have the standardized testing topic the next day, and it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. But the point is, again, another example of how information is dissuasive. Yeah. Okay, Baudrillard's relationship to politics. So, Baudrillard's relationship to politics. So, politics is fundamentally illuminated by information, i.e., we grasp things about the real world by determining and producing information about it to illuminate reality. So there's this fantastic Shapiro 17 evidence which describes Baudrillard's analysis of how information is dissuasive to the post-truth Donald Trump era. And it describes how Donald Trump, when he rose in 2015, a lot of them, I don't know if y'all remember Trump's rise to the candidacy, but a lot of leftist media were religiously attacking Donald Trump. They were like, Donald Trump is a racist. Donald Trump is xenophobe. Well, like clearly, like they still do that today, but like Donald Trump just made fun of a disabled reporter, et cetera, et cetera. Like endless roasts about Donald Trump coming from the left. But the question we have to ask ourselves, and the question that Shapiro talks about is, did this leftist attack on Donald Trump actually illuminate reality in some kind of way? Or did it persuade people? Did it persuade people on the right? Did it persuade people on the base that Donald Trump is this horrible person and they need to vote against Donald Trump? And the answer is, Shapiro thinks the answer is no, because a lot of the reason why Donald Trump rose in 2016 is not because Donald Trump is this like savior of like the white middle class farmer from Kansas, but Donald Trump rose because the media made him out to be a complete spectacle and spectacularized his image. Donald Trump, a lot of the reasons why Donald Trump won is because a lot of like the belt rust in the Middle East thought that Trump represented someone who is anti-establishment, who is going to shake up politics forever and forever, and someone who's just basically like fuck you to the left. And it shows how the truth about Donald Trump being a racist really didn't matter to those voters, because it kind of just made a simulacrum of him, or it made some kind of sign of Donald Trump where he became this hyper Donald Trump. And this represented something that was extremely important for a lot of people. So it showed how the leftist attacks on Donald Trump didn't actually dissuade people from not voting for him, but it actually just led more and more to his rise. Another example is we live in a post-truth era where basically anything anyone says can potentially be taken true. Like when Donald Trump said people can like take Lysol to fight coronavirus, like some people took that to heart. Like it doesn't matter that obviously that's stupid and like no one like it's not backed off by scientific evidence at all. The point is that it's the truth for some people, and it shows how there's basically no truth anymore, because these kind of things that are not backed by scientific evidence, these kind of things that are not backed by anything, can be the truth for some people. It doesn't matter if you give more information about how Donald Trump is a racist, about how masks are useful for preventing the rise of coronavirus, because some people will just not believe the thing. And it just kind of just creates the spectacle where people think the left is attacking them more and more. I'll go into more questions at the Q&A, so hold on to your questions for now. Okay, and another thing is Baudrillard thinks that fundamentally that politics itself has turned into a TV show, and that the criminal justice system, all of these things that are relevant in our society, has turned into a complete reality TV show. For example, in the 2016 election, when like you should ask yourselves, like, why do we even have presidential debates? Like, they don't inform voters in any single way. Like, we all know what these people's positions are, but like completely like Baudrillard would think that these like political like discussions and political debates are only created for the sake of media reality or media ratings, and to posit like every single candidate as like a reality TV show. O.J. Simpson in the 1990s, when was trying to get acquitted for killing his wife Nicole Simpson. The endless TV shows followed O.J. Simpson as if it was just another reality show. People hung onto their TV as if it was some kind of like bachelorette TV show party. It shows how like these kind of politics have degraded into a media of spectacularization, and also everything is fundamentally seems more and more like a TV show in our everyday life. I was about to show the President Bush video, but I guess I don't have to. But allegedly killing his wife, yes. Okay, so I guess you can watch it on your own time. Here, I'll send it out later, but another example of where Baudrillard's thought is most prevalent is war itself. Baudrillard thinks that war itself has disappeared and is now a media spectacle controlled by the media and by the United States to create this kind of image. What does this mean? So, okay, can anyone tell me why they think the Vietnam War was fought? If you know your history. Contain communism. Yeah. So is that actually the reason? There was not a lot of... Baudrillard will probably think that the Vietnam War was not fought for the reasons that the United States told us. The United States told us that we had to contain the USSR in the Southeast Asian region because of the domino theory. When the USSR takes Vietnam, they'll be able to take countries like Laos, they'll be able to take countries like the Philippines, and the entire Asia will be communist. But LBJ during this time didn't have that much data to point this out. And also there wasn't much data that the Soviet Union was interested in kind of intervening within the power. So when Baudrillard says the Gulf War wasn't real, he's not saying that these wars didn't happen. He's saying that these perceptions of wars don't actually fit in with reality. The way that we signify about these wars and the way that we describe these wars doesn't actually fit in with the reality. For example, as many of you said, Lyndon B. Johnson who declared it? I forget. Yeah, LBJ declared Vietnam for the guise of containing communism, but there was a lot of evidence to indicate that LBJ was actually declaring Vietnam so that we could expand U.S. influence in South Asia and Southeast Asia and gain economic power within the entire region. Likewise, the Gulf War. The Gulf War, I don't know as much about the Gulf War, so I'll describe the Iraq War. So the Iraq War, obviously in 2003, if you don't know anything about this, basically Colin Powell spoke up to the entirety of the world in the United Nations and was like, Baudrillard would say, well, Baudrillard would think that these wars are fought for imperialist tendencies, i.e. to expand U.S. influence onto the rest of the international order, but he thinks that the United States makes up lies, such as we need to contain like USSR expansion and like annexation of these and all of these things. So another example, so in 2003, basically in the Iraq War, if you don't know anything about this, Colin Powell, who was like a high security advisor during that time, basically gave this like really convincing plea to the UN that Saddam Hussein has Secretary of Defense, that Saddam Hussein has WMDs and is going to blow up the entirety of the world, basically. And then obviously President Bush announced the start of the Iraq War like moments later, and every single American was on board with the Iraq War. Like, liberals will probably tell you that they hated the Iraq War. That's probably just not true. Like, Democrats supported the Iraq War, Republicans supported the Iraq War, everyone but Bernie Sanders supported the Iraq War, right? And what was this operation called? It was called Operation Iraqi Freedom. The United States is going to go into the Middle East, free some Iraqi people away from the oppressive Saddam Hussein, etc., etc. But what were the actual underlying motives for this? Most reasonable people see this as an attempt to expand U.S. imperialist tendencies and get oil from the Middle East, right? So first, the United States wanted presence in the Middle East. So what the United States did is they controlled the media in a way so that it was like Saddam Hussein has WMDs. Saddam Hussein is this bad man that we need to take out, and we need to liberate all these Iraqi people. So, but obviously that wasn't true. We found out years later, after like years of warfare, that there were no WMDs, that Bush and Powell and Donald Rumsfeld and all these like neocons of the 2000s just basically made up this lie. But the point is that it didn't matter because this lie became the truth for a lot of people. So it shows how the war didn't actually happen because the depictions of the war didn't actually match up with reality. Another argument that Baudrillard posits is this kind of control, like this metaphysics of control, and you'll see it materialize in debate through bewildered transparency. Like I think every single Baudrillard debater says the words bewildered transparency at like one point in the debate. So what this means is Baudrillard thinks that this kind of like stems back to like a lot of other postmodernists like Heidegger and also like a lot of other postmodernists who think along these lines also. But he thinks that the United States has this kind of, the United States and other powers, obviously, the United States has this kind of tendency to try to control the entirety of the world. So what happens is that there are these things that are not transparent to us, that are opaque to us, and things that we don't understand in the real world. For example, like Islam is something that the West cannot comprehend. The West can just fundamentally not understand Middle Eastern politics because we have this Eurocentric perspective of how politics should operate, but it just obviously doesn't operate because of different geopolitical situations in the Middle East. So what the United States does is we see this thing that's mysterious to us, we see this thing that's confusing to us, and instead of just living with this mystery, instead of just being like, oh, you're different from us, we're not going to try to understand you, and we respect your difference. What the United States does is we preemptively bomb the living hell out of everything that's mysterious to us and tries to eliminate all of these, as Baudrillard debaters say, unknown unknowns, things that are mysterious to us, and try to render them transparent and try to understand them. And one of the ways of trying to understand them is just by eliminating them before they can attack us. So this is why, like, post 9/11, this is why George Bush said things like there are potential terrorists in the Middle East, there are potential people who could kill us and destroy the entirety of the world with WMDs, so that we could justify intervention, so that we can basically kill all these people before they can kill us, right? So this is Baudrillard's theory of deterrence. Obviously, y'all debated the nukes topic, and one of the biggest thing was MAD. And Baudrillard thinks that the United States and the Soviet Union posited this theory of deterrence upon the international arena, where we try to deter things before it happens to us. We try to eliminate everything that could potentially be a threat to us before it happens, right? So this creates massive interventions because obviously there are things that we don't understand in things like Vietnam. Oh, another example is Spanos actually kind of utilizes like Baudrillard's and Heidegger's theory of this kind of same idea of like eliminating all unknown unknowns. Yeah, so no, Rifik, it's like, yes, we try to understand, well, we try to have a complete understanding of the world, right? So if there's mystery to us, what's one way to get a complete understanding of the world? Just eliminating the mystery, right? Yeah, so I'll explain that, Rifik. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the postmodern is kind of like grouped together, but Spanos in his book Anatomy of Empire, Spanos is like this kind of like person who takes Heidegger and applies it to the international order. We should eliminate all life that is like, or the United States thinks that we should eliminate all life that is mysterious to us and things that we don't understand. So another example of this is that Spanos talks about how in Vietnam, there was all this mystery in the forests of Vietnam. There were all these things that we didn't understand and that could potentially be a threat to us, right? So what did the United States do? The United States took napalm and blew the living hell out of these forests. Like, if you see like some of the footage of the Vietnam War, like, oh my God, like napalm just like obliterated acres and acres of forest. And this was, as Spanos talks about, yeah, the smell of napalm in the morning, the Apocalypse Now movie, great movie. The Spanos talks about how this kind of blowing up a forest is what allowed the United States to reveal the mystery underneath and eliminate all of it. So this also connects back to Baudrillard's thesis of death. So you'll see this a lot written by authors like Robson 12, which are for some reason always in Baudrillard case, in the 2NR also, that Baudrillard thinks that this kind of like reason why we cannot stand the other and why we need to preemptively eliminate them is because we are fundamentally scared of death. And because we are fundamentally scared of death, we want to kill all things that could potentially lead us to die, and also things that are closer to death. If you like know anything about Afro-pessimism, Wilderson thinks that Afro-pessimism exists, or the world is anti-Black because Blackness is always in a position of death. So the United States, as a result, similarly, things that are closer to death to us, things that could represent death to us, the United States tries to eliminate all of these things, which is why why in the 80s, like you can argue that Reagan didn't even care about the queer AIDS epidemic happening in the queer community because these things already represented death to Reagan and the white people, the white straight people at the top of politics. And it was okay to just let them die because they were already closer to death, et cetera, et cetera. So Baudrillard thinks that because of the securitization against death, it leads to this form of politics where we try to eliminate other people that are deviant from us, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I want everyone to listen to this for 5 minutes. Real quick, so deterrence, like the theory of deterrence, it's not like, I guess it's not in the traditional concept of IR, but Baudrillard thinks that we need to deter all potential threats and basically make the world sanitized of mystery, right? So Baudrillard thinks that like US imperialism, as a result, tries to deter other people from attacking us. But this deterrence kind of has this kind of like mechanism where it's like massive interventions are necessary to get rid of these forms of mystery, right? Okay, can everyone take like the next 6 minutes and listen to this Michigan KM2AR? The timestamp's already there. Oh, and then going back to the definition of voter transparency, well, it's like basically what you think it sounds like voter transparency equals like the drive to make everything transparent and eliminate mystery. I mean, it's voter transparency is like a thing that I'm pretty sure like debaters made up. So like, I don't think it's a term Baudrillard actually used. Like, I'm pretty sure this team actually made up the word voter transparency. Oh, sorry. It started at the beginning. Go to 1 hour and 55 minutes.
Communication is not a natural but an ideological form. In debate, we reduce that which we represent to information blips that we trade on the market of speculative capital. Debate is a closed informational schema that does very real violence to that which it claims to represent. Debate is MSNBC, is the Stop the War movement. Is the Stop the War movement? It's complicit in the attempt to make the whole world transparent, to pin it down within language. As long as we win this argument, even if they win nitpicky technical issues, we have impact terms, the form that every single one of their arguments presupposes. We have impact earned positivism, we have impact earned every single piece of research argument, impact earned their dialogue argument, and their attempt to limit the topic at all. They are complicit in the genocidal war on terror that is taking place on a global scale. Their whole argument is that we should make debate more transparent. They will maybe win some link differential arguments that say that we do this too, but all those things are fundamentally defensive. We have the only chance to break out of these things. Their double turn argument is our solvency. We are the implosion from within. Remember that our evidence indicates that no system is abolished through liberation like what they talk about, but rather only by pushing it to its own hyperlogic, revealing its own fundamental absurdity. We use the communicative form of debate to trap itself in its own trap. To trap itself in its own trap, we will prove transparently that transparency is bad. Our 1AR gives the example in the context of debate of things like of the way that the 1AC will be commodified by your ballot, but that will insert it into the research commodity of the research curriculum of debate, just like how
also, just let me know when Jeong
mass marketable commodities in the revolt the role for revolt of May 68, just like the graffiti you see on your way to work was mass produced, copied in a number of places, but you still see it, reveals that other worlds are possible. Their Ritter evidence is probably one of their only chances to win the debate. This evidence simply says that we should use exterior to debate norms to try to solve social justice issues. Our argument is not about social justice. It's about prerequisite question about the communicative form of debate that we implode from within. Crucial framing argument that your RFD saying this back to them will be the completion of the trap. It will be locking in the fundamental implosion of the form of debate, which answers their best piece of defensive arguments about how we link to ourselves. Yeah, all these presumption arguments basically answered by that counterclaim. The charity cannibalism argument, they conceded a crucial uniqueness argument that the way that the West sustains itself throughout the totality, and the way that debate sustains itself is through the will to transparency, through the attempt to know everything, through the attempt to know everything, reduce it to consumable objects, that without this good feeling of engaging with the world outside of itself, the communicative model of debate would collapse. So we solved. Their argument is that our Galloway evidence is in the context of video gaming. That's just not true. You should read this piece of evidence. It says that all attempts of reform that remain within the logic of semiotic conformity simply produce the same conformity of values that ultimately proves our transparency arguments. The way that MSNBC versus Fox News simply confirms the will to transcribe the totality of existence within language and information. It's fundamentally unethical and a genocidal way of being in the world. You should obviously reject it. Topicality. They need to win that the imposition of transparency onto the topic is a good thing. We have huge dissents to a lot of their arguments, and they of the 2NR is a fundamentally defensive speech with very little impact framing offense, so you should not mine through their evidence for them to find impact calculus arguments that they have not made. They say that ruptures fail. The role of debate is a question of communicative model. We're not trying to create a total rupture with everything that exists. Rather, we're trying to create a more ethical mode of communicating and engaging with the world. They say the Schaefer-Trump villain arguments. We have not made an affect argument in this debate. We have not asked you to evaluate the emotive form of our speeches. Rather, we said that the communicative form that those things take place, i.e. the exchange of hyper-positivist information that eliminates mystery, is one that is unethical. Now, the truth testing arguments, that is the need to understand them. Our argument is understanding is bad, something they have never at all engaged in at any point in the debate. You should maintain that intelligence of mystery. Value to life. What the fuck is their answer to that? They dropped it. Very easy way to vote affirmative. They have conceded that the attempt to expunge mystery from debate, even if there is some mystery included in their vision of the topic, is fundamentally one that attempts to limit it. The attempt to limit information destroys.
Yeah, Tyler was definitely frustrated in this round. It's because Michigan K, I'm always like kind of beat them and just trolled the hell out of
Their
them.
interpretation can have some unpredictability. That's like buying a lottery ticket every day. We actually offer you the ability to max out value to life. So the affirmative is kind of like betting millions of dollars on a losing hand, and that gamble, that willingness to chance, is our internal value to life that they do not access. We have a couple of conceded defensive impact arguments that should be enough to mitigate those, considering they have no impact calculus, comparing their impacts to our impacts. New affirmatives in debate and new affirmatives, and they are totally unpredictable, rely on completely absurd interpretations of the topic. Even with plan text, are totally inevitable at the NDT. So either they get to fiat out of all of this offense, or counter interpretation, their interpretation plus our app, fiats out of it just as much. They say that people will flunk out of school. How and why? This
Okay,
is not unique. There's a proliferation.
It's okay if you're not done, because you probably don't need to listen to the entire thing. But this 2AR is basically like the only ways that like Baudrillard debaters like kind of use Baudrillard in debate, except for like the death thesis and like the fear of death bad stuff. So let's analyze it. So the relationship between debate and Baudrillard, one is that at the top of the speech, Michigan KM explains that debate is a closed communicative schema. Michigan KM thinks that debate kind of exchanges this information around, but this information isn't actually corresponded to reality, and it's only closed within itself. So similarly, like when I told you about how like things like the stock market and things like art, things like the consumption of science, things like fashion trends are a closed schema, they're also making the same claim that debate doesn't actually refer to anything in reality, but it's just closed in itself, in that like probably only like debaters understand debate. Like to like every single person, things like spreading, things like this kind of like nuke war scenarios that we always explain, like this is just ridiculous talk. Like politics does not operate by like thinking about like Michigan Cam won on a 2-1, but politics does not operate by like just like imagining up nuclear war scenarios and just trading it among each other. Like there's obviously like a very big disconnect between how debate thinks about politics and like how policymakers think about politics. So again, closed communicative schema. Second is transparency. Yeah. The Baudrillard debater one, yeah. Second is transparency. Fundamentally, like at a fundamental level, debate is about producing knowledge about the world, right? It's about producing transparency to understand the world. Baudrillard obviously criticizes this. He almost criticizes the kind of consumption of knowledge that we have about the world, that we should just remain kind of just coexistent with this kind of mystery and not try to eliminate it. So this is what people like talk about when they're like debaters are the reincarnation of Karl Rove, because Karl Rove tried to eliminate all unknown unknowns by declaring things like the Iraq War, right? Likewise, the Michigan KM debaters are making a claim that the knowledge that we reproduce in this round is fundamentally unethical because it replicates the same kind of drive to eliminate mystery and to understand the world and drive transparency, right? So that's their argument about how, that's basically their argument, that debate is a closed communicative schema. We spectacularize things, i.e. the person who could really, yeah. So it's a closed communicative schema in that, like, basically the scenarios that we think of are not actually connected to real politics. Like no one in like Washington DC is like thinking about like, well, no one in Washington DC is thinking about how like marijuana delegalization on the policy topic would lead to, like, what was that scenario? I read this app. It was marijuana delegalization is necessary to drive cartel violence down. Cartel violence spills up to Latin America. Latin America instability leads to Russians like building bases upon Latin America. Russian building bases upon Latin America allows a preemptive strike with the United States. And then the United States like obviously engages back, and then that blows up to a nuclear war. Like that kind of stuff only makes sense to debaters. Like no one else in the world thinks about politics that way. So it kind of shows how debate is like this closed community away from the entirety of the world, right? The next concept that they talk about is charity cannibalism, which I'll highlight through this. Okay, so y'all probably remember when like Kobe Bryant passed away, sadly, in January. Like he passed away, but like why did people feel the need to post about it? Like obviously we know Kobe Bryant died, but why do people find a need to post about Kobe Bryant? Open-ended question. Virtual signaling? Likes? Yeah, for clout. Like y'all understand this. Like charity cannibalism is the thesis that basically we are invested in the suffering that happens in the real world. When something bad happens in the real world, we commodify the suffering and we use it for our own personal gains. For example, Hurricane Katrina happens. CNN gets more media ratings because they're posting about Hurricane Katrina. Likewise, Kobe Bryant passes away very sadly. Then people post about Kobe Bryant because they want more clout, they want likes, etc., etc. So this shows that we are invested within the kind of suffering that we are criticizing. And likewise, think about how like when debaters are talking about suffering and they're trying to find the newest cards, they find the article that describes the most suffering. Like when someone cuts like an abolished ICE AF, like on this like criminal justice topic, right? They look for an article that's like ICE is caging these poor children, and then they use it in that overview, like thousands of children are dying, et cetera, but then they're getting the ballot for this. It kind of shows how they're commodifying the suffering of these people, and it shows how debate isn't separate from the rest of the world, but debate needs the suffering to sustain itself, right? The GSP, Ria, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that acronym is. So likewise, the Baudrillard thinks that the West is not, I'm not someone to ask about tricks. Baudrillard thinks that the West would not be able to sustain itself without the suffering of others. So we constantly require more and more suffering so that we can sustain ourselves. So charity cannibalism, basically, Baudrillard thinks that because we're invested in the suffering, more suffering needs to be created, which is bad, right? So you can see how that's related to debate, right? Do I need to give more examples? What if we only require our own suffering? No, it's not suffering is good. It's that we are invested within the suffering that we are criticizing. So actually things like debate require more suffering and it creates more suffering. Yeah. Another example is like on the policy topic and on the military aid topic last year, the Saudi AF was a huge AF, and like Saudi was about to be inherent or not inherent because like the war in Yemen was starting to wrap up. Trump passed some bills, et cetera. Like instead of being happy about this, that we advocated for a lot of these, like a lot of people were sad about this because they wanted to read their policy AFs, right? Okay, how do we escape this? I don't think I'll have time to explain symbolic exchange and why Baudrillard thinks that terrorism might be an acceptable response to this system. So I'll just explain negation. So the concept of negation is basically just like, you know, like those alternatives on the K that are just like, the world is so fucked, we can't do anything. The only thing we can do is reject the AF, right? Well, this is basically it. Like Baudrillard thinks that like the world is so screwed up that politics is so dead that the only thing we can do is just do nothing. Like we need to withdraw from the system. And like an important example that you can like talk about what negation could potentially look like is, remember my conversation about how like the leftist media only added up to the spectacularization of Trump? You can say like if the left were to just ignore Trump, if the left were to just negate Trump, just ignore that Trump existed at all, Trump would not, well, yeah, obviously Baudrillard believed in the thing he said, but Trump would not exist in today's world. If CNN did not report on Donald Trump at all, then he would not be president of the United States, like at all. No way. So it shows how this kind of negation away from the system can be potentially powerful in that it can subvert the system, right? And if any of you know Baudrillard, the semio-capitalist author, Baudrillard offers a very similar explanation of how we should deal with the hyper-industrial capitalist society. He thinks that we should just basically withdraw from the system and basically just stop being productive, right? So likewise, in the context of debate, like this is like a good alternative to make against the affirmative. Like the alternative is to reject the AF, but you could also defend it as like a form of politics in that this kind of rejection of the AF is powerful. Yeah. Semio-cap's like similar to Baudrillard. It's just like talking about how capitalism today is not based off production, but it's based off like information over accumulation. Like it's based off like workers having to like mentally think about things instead of like physically labor, which like Baudrillard thinks is like worse and like is really bad. Like that's basically it. It's kind of similar to Baudrillard. Okay. Responding to Baudrillard. So
you have to realize that the Baudrillard debater is probably sounding like like nonsensical to the policy judges, right? Or like even K judges. Like Baudrillard probably has like the worst clout possible on the circuit besides tricks as like an argument that most people hate, right? So what you need to make against Baudrillard when you're dealing with these Baudrillard answers is you need to just make common sense arguments. Baudrillard thinks that activism is dead, that liberation is impossible, we should do nothing. Well, ask the Baudrillard debater, did the George Floyd protests do nothing? Did people protesting Lake Parkland High do nothing? Did people protesting anti-war protests in the 1960s against Vietnam, the hippies in the 1960s, did it do nothing? The answer is probably no. Like these kind of things of activism did materially change things. And the way that you can phrase it is be like, yes, they could be right about the totalizing claim about the world, but there's ways to meaningfully improve the situation of people. The Baudrillard debater as a response. Yeah, Aaron, exactly. Like the Baudrillard debater as a response is put in a very tough situation, right? Because they basically have to be like, whoa, George Floyd protests did nothing. Vietnam War protests did nothing, right? Like you can see how like from like an ethos standpoint, they're already on the downhill. Second is, well, obviously against like all Ks, you want to make a framework argument that you get to weigh the AF, that you get to that links should be to the plan, right? They can't just disprove that debate is bad, and because that doesn't disprove the AF, right? So another way of thinking about framework is just like, it's like a TJF that's like, because of fairness, like links should be to the plan and not to like debate or something else, right? So on those framework arguments, you can make arguments that like debate is fundamentally a game. Like think about why we do debate. Like, does debate really turn us into Karl Rove? Does debate turn us into George Bush, et cetera, et cetera? The answer is no. Like debate, like when I advocate for like Baudrillard, like it doesn't mean I have to believe in Baudrillard. Like at a fundamental level, you can like think of debate as just like a game that we play, and we have meaning towards game, and under meaning things need to be fair, right? So this is one step you can take with framework, right? Another step you can take is like debate is good. Like debate does not produce Karl Rove. Debate produces like people who are engaged with the real world, who are engaged in activism, who are engaged in trying to make the world better and better, right? Like think about like just like common sense answers. Like would you like has debate improved your understanding of the world? If the answer is yes, then like debate is probably good. Like who cares about like if like debate produced like one Karl Rove, when like for a lot of people it develops critical thinking skills, like, and you could like use that to link turn their offense. Like you don't necessarily have to impact turn their offense, you can use it to link turn their offense, and being like absent debate we wouldn't even know about things like Baudrillard, like, and we wouldn't be able to develop critical thinking skills about imperialism, about like the media, et cetera, et cetera. Like how many of you would know about Baudrillard absent debate? The answer is like probably like close to zero, right? Like I didn't know about Baudrillard before debate. Yeah, no problem. And then the third thing is like, this is like very, like you can do this against a lot of Ks. You can just impact turn their offense. Like one of the weakest things that K debaters are doing or are able to defend is like K debaters are usually really good at defending their theory and defending their links, but they're not able to defend their impact. So when Baudrillard debaters are like, Iraq war was horrible, you can probably make the like really morally or like you need to be careful with these, right? You can make the argument that the Iraq war was necessary and that their understanding of the world is problematic, right? Another thing is you can say that Baudrillard criticizes US primacy, but like you could just impact turn that, be like US hegemony is good. US hegemony is what led to like the most peaceful time in history by creating this like nuclear umbrella, and it created a liberal order that was much more peaceful than other arguments or other periods of times. And when they're like, well, obviously US primacy was bad, look at Vietnam, etc., you can be like, yeah, we agree that US primacy is bad, but like the alternative, we have to look at the alternative, which is Chinese hegemony, Russian hegemony, which is probably like much worse than what the US would do in terms of like their colonization of like Africa through the Belt and Road Initiative, et cetera, right? So then you can make like an argument like they don't have an alternative vision for the international order, which means that their politics is bad, because like you need to be able to
explain an alternative vision of the international order. Otherwise, your kind of debate theory is just debate nonsense, right? It's just theorizing. It doesn't materialize to the real world, right? Other impact turns you could do is charity cannibalism good. Explaining that people are suffering in the real world. Like, ask yourself what the alternative to charity cannibalism is. Is it just not talking about suffering at all? Is it just not talking about things that are happening on ice at all? Like, it's apathy, right? Exactly, it's apathy, which is arguably worse, right? Another example, impact turn information. Be like, no, information is good. If we didn't know about like what happened to George Floyd, if we didn't know about the Minneapolis horrible atrocities that are happening in police, would these kind of forms of protests have happened? The answer is probably not, right? Because the information was able to create material change, right? Okay, so I opened back up to this opening slide because I want to talk about generally that every single time you want to run a K, you should think about how this debater would think, or not, this author would think about the world, right? So when I read Baudrillard last summer, very unfortunate that I read Baudrillard, but when I spent a lot of time looking, when I spent a lot of time, wait, I'll get to your questions very soon. When I spent a lot of time reading Baudrillard, I started thinking about the world, and I started thinking about history in the context of how Baudrillard would think about history. So every single time you're running a K, like you're running Wilderson, right? Think about what Wilderson would think about the George Floyd protests. Think about like how would Wilderson think about the recent events that have happened in terms of police brutality and the grassroots movements, right? How would Baudrillard, similarly, how would Baudrillard think about Watergate? How would Baudrillard think about Reagan getting shot? How would Baudrillard think about George Bush declaring Gulf War, the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, Bush II declaring the Iraq War, Obama's Tan Sue, and Trump, right? What would Baudrillard think about every single one of these situations, and how would he respond to it? What would Baudrillard think about Andy Warhol's Campo tomato soup cans, right? Like, what would Baudrillard think about these like Vietnam atrocities that were happening and the media coverage of it? What would Baudrillard think about 9/11, right? Think about every single instance of why and Baudrillard, of how Baudrillard would think about the world and run with it. Like, once you understand how Baudrillard would understand the world, then you can understand how Baudrillard would think about debate, how Baudrillard would think about like claims like limits, like fairness, like education, et cetera, right? So this is just like, I just want to like really stress that this is how you should approach every single K author that you're dealing with. Just take the world from their own vision. Yeah. Okay. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I also, if y'all didn't catch, I inserted these subliminal messages to show how we are all beholden and we are basically laborers to these advertisement companies. Oh, I'll also send out a reading list after the round or after the lecture. Okay, so Q&A time. Can everyone like repeat? Can everyone repeat their questions that they asked throughout the lecture? Like I can stay as long as y'all want. So like if there's a lot of questions, I can spend a lot of time like answering them. Okay, yeah. So the first one, can you just briefly summarize the best answers you mentioned again? I think, again, like the best answers to Baudrillard a lot of times are like impact turning stuff. Like Baudrillard would say activism is bad, be like activism is good, hegemony is bad, hegemony is good, debate is bad, debate is good, etc., etc. Like oftentimes like you'll find that like the true, well, I'm not saying hegemony good is a true thing, right? The other things are probably true, like activism is good, debate is good, right? So oftentimes you'll find that like Baudrillard debaters like just get out ethos because their argument just sounds ridiculous to most judges, and that's why I think like the best like policy debater would be able to beat the best Baudrillard debater because these answers are just so true. So just like impact turn, right? Let's see. Is Baudrillard sexist a powerful argument, and how do I leverage and knock the kid? Yeah. So I think that if they're reading primer, I think, okay, this is just my opinion, and like other people disagree with me. I think that Baudrillard is sexist, and these kind of like author critiques are most useful when they're reading primary source Baudrillard, right? Like, I think it's pretty difficult to say that like Baudrillard's sexist applies to like the Shapiro 17 card or the Archer and Debris 14 card, because they don't utilize like Baudrillard's theories of femme and like seduction, right? So I think one is that if you're a Baudrillard debater, like you should just read secondary source arguments. Like I think it just like gets you out of like a ton of author knocks also. But like secondly, I think Baudrillard is sexist is a very good out against like people who are still using primary source Baudrillard. Can we go over seduction? Seduction would probably take too long, and also I'm not as familiar with seduction. The seduction was always kind of like an iffy point for me, probably for you also. But like, I don't think seduction's ever been used inside of debate, so I don't think you have to really worry about that. I also don't think that it could be really applied to debate from what I read about it. Yeah. So the question is, can you explain the warrant to why resistance to capital/worker strikes are necessary for the sustenance of capitalism? Yeah. So basically what the media and like the kind of like bureaucrats at top, what they try to do is they try to give the illusion that capitalism is still mediated by production and not by science, right? So what they need is, if there were no worker strikes ever, then like that would probably give the illusion away. Because like if things are still based off production and things like wages still matter, then like obviously like laborers would still like need to continue to fight against capitalism, because that's what the history of the like capitalist society has been. There have been worker strikes, there has been some negotiation of wages, etc., 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 right? So if these strikes never existed, then it would probably give the illusion away. So Baudrillard thinks that these strikes are necessary so that they could be signified as a strike, and it's like, look, capitalism still exists, right? What was the fourth point on escaping Baudrillard? Let me look. Do I have time to explain? Okay, anti-semiotic counterforce is basically just like, I don't even know if Baudrillard writes about this, but like Michigan KM and like Ronick and all these like Baudrillard debaters used it all the time. Basically, it's like, in the proliferation of signs, what we can do as a response is by producing signs that are nonsense and signs that are like just like completely meaningless, and it subverts the system in and of itself. It's like basically like, think about like this is why Michigan KM trolled so much. Like think about if like Michigan KM, like every single person trolled like Michigan KM, then like debate would probably collapse in and of itself, right? Because they're making fun of debate so much that like there's no point in debating anymore, right? So it's like kind of creating these kind of signs that are meaningless, etc., right? Why is speculation counted as information? Example, what's going on Twitter? Well, speculation is just a form of information. Like, don't think of information in like kind of like Baudrillard. Like, don't think of it as like a special term. Like, information just means information. So when someone's like speculating, like Donald Trump is sexist, right? That's not really speculation. I guess that's just true. But like another example is like when people were speculating about like who the Boston bomber, like who the Boston bombers were, they were like producing information. They're like, this person is the Boston bomber. This kind of speculation was like producing information, right? I like presumption is a good strat. Presumption is a good strat against Baudrillard debaters. Oh yeah. I can talk about that a little bit. So when you're negating against a Baudrillard KF, you should always probably run presumption, because ultimately like this isn't presumption as in like presumption as in like presumption of firms because of time scale. This is presumption in the sense of like the affirmative's role in this debate is to prove a shift away from the status quo. And insofar that the Baudrillard AF doesn't do anything, but it's only an impact turn to topicality, and it's only an impact turn to debate, it's basically just like, imagine if an AF went up there and was just like, debate and knowledge is bad. And it's like, they sit down. It's like, so what? Like, you didn't do anything. Like, you didn't affirm the topic. You didn't like produce like a performance that like challenges debate. Like you just literally just went up there and said debate is bad. And you can make these arguments that like presumption, like then you would presume negative because the affirmative is only an impact turn to topicality, right? And they don't actually do anything. Shapiro is not Ben Shapiro, just to clarify. Shapiro's like I don't think Ben Shapiro knows who Baudrillard is.
Noted Baudrillard scholar Ben Shapiro. Absolutely.
Baudrillard, yeah. So Baudrillard thinks that worker strikes are necessary to sustain itself. It's like just to give the illusion, basically. Implosion. Baudrillard. Could Baudrillard be used to trigger skep? Probably. Again, I'm not a tricks debater, so like I think you would have to ask like Perry or someone. I don't know. Okay.
I actually know the answer to this question.
Yeah, Patrick, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Patrick. For those of you who don't know, I'm one of the admins here. I debate for UH. I also coach a lot of debaters to read this stuff. I was just popping in to see how the lecture was going. I just finished recording a seminar for Jonathan and Joanne's project, Equal Debate Initiative, which you should all go check out if you're interested in more resources and seminars from camp. I just recorded about 2 hours of a Dr. Ricky Garner talking to us about psychoanalysis. Jonathan, I'll send you that recording later. I have to edit it down.
All right. Sounds cool.
But yeah, so to answer the question, does Baudrillard trigger skep? We actually did this at Valley, me and one of my debaters, Dylan, where, yeah, Baudrillard can sort of be warranted out to trigger external world skepticism because he's kind of a determinist. Have you sort of talked about just like, Jonathan, the idea of just like no external resistance to the system yet?
Oh no, I haven't. I haven't talked about like the polit stuff.
Okay. So well, I won't steal your thunder. Like this is not my lecture, and I'm sure you have much more, interesting visual aids and sort of explanations of it. But part of Baudrillard's argument, which Jonathan's going to get into, is that there's no longer an outside to the code, to this sort of system of symbolic exchange. Everything's contained within it. And so as a result, every sort of social relation is predicated upon this sort of symbolic sort of like relationship and a predetermined sort of outcome based on the code. The way that I explain it to my debaters is the code is smarter than you. It is thinking about you even when you were not thinking about it. And the second you think of a thing, it has already thought about that thing and it has thought about all the possible things that could come of it. This is a sort of gross simplification, but basically, yeah, you can use Baudrillard to trigger like external world skepticism because he's basically kind of, in his own way, a determinist. A determinist is someone who like doesn't believe that like it believes all outcomes are predetermined. Now he doesn't believe free will exists. The other way you can use Baudrillard to trigger skep is like I think less cool, but I guess strategic. I apologize if you hear a bunch of like dogs barking in the background. My baby brother's playing with our dog right now. But the other way you can use Baudrillard to trigger skepticism is just the linguistic skep stuff, i.e. there is no one-to-one correspondence between signifier and signified, which means that there's no sort of generative way to sort of generate ethical obligations within relations to each other or communication, because language is arbitrary and doesn't exist. Sorry, liberals. Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to pop in just because I actually, like, I just happened to pop in at the right time and I do know the answer to that question. Yeah. It sounds like the lecture's going well. I'll leave you to it. I just wanted to pop in and just say thanks for donating your time, Johnny.
Oh, of course, Patrick. It was a lot of fun.
Of course, yeah. All right. I'll get out of your hair and let you have your lecture back. I just, wanted to just check and make stuff going. All right. Adios, kids. Yeah. Peace.
Yeah. Rifik, I'm going to explain symbolic exchange. So, symbolic exchange is kind of like Baudrillard always describes it in some kind of like very abstract manner and like never really like contextualizes it to history. But symbolic exchange. Okay, just think about. I think the best way to think about this is like thinking about what it's not. So, if you think about like the tenets of capitalism, it's based off accumulation of wealth and it's based off like production and like constant like generation of wealth, right? So Baudrillard thinks that a society that has symbolic exchange is not based off accumulation, but it's based off reciprocity, where
it's not like you're trying to generate like give as many like gain as much money as possible, but he thinks that these societies are tied by this thing called like reciprocity, where it's like if you give a gift to someone, then that person has to give a gift to you back, right? This is what Baudrillard talks about when he writes in the context of, oh, what's that guy's, I don't know, it's like French, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but like there's this one philosopher who talks about gift exchanges. And so that's how he thinks that like societies in the past operated, by not accumulation, right? This is also similar to Bataille's understanding of general expenditure. If you like ever saw like Toomey like run like Bataille this past year, Baudrillard thinks that like past societies, they didn't try to accumulate wealth again, or not Baudrillard and Bataille both think this, but they try to like be as generous as possible with their like energy and like the kind of things that they did, right? This is what they mean by general expenditure, right? So it's just like in comparison to capitalism, it's just like anti-accumulation, et cetera, right? Yeah. Again, symbolic exchange is very kind of like I've never seen a good historical explanation of what symbolic exchange looks like. But I guess in the context, I can't really think of a good example to be like. There's the hostage taking stuff, which is a form of symbolic exchange, but I always thought hostage taking was kind of silly. Could I go over the death stuff more robustly? Yeah. So Baudrillard in his book 1976, Symbolic Exchange and Death, theorizes like what are the origins of production and what are the origins of why we started developing into capitalism, right? And Baudrillard thinks that like the reason for this, or like in debate terms, like the root cause of this, is because of our securitization of death. So again, like a lot of like these kind of postmodern authors who are like, oh, these past societies had a different way of living, or it's kind of like one, fetishization, and two, it's kind of like totalizingly like absurd to a point. So like this is like a good like K you can write against Baudrillard after, or against like Bataille, right? Like they have a totalizing like understanding of how like indigenous groups operated, and they have like a weird fetishization, et cetera, and like it almost depicts them as like primitive before capitalism, right? So that's a good K you can write against this. But basically Baudrillard like analyzes where our understandings of production came from, and he thought that like other societies had a different conception of death than biological. So the West posits that after death, nothing happens, right? Like you're dead, like, right? And like the vast majority of scientific understandings on the West has come from this scientific and cosmological religious writings, right? Baudrillard thinks that other societies, like Asian societies or like indigenous societies, like thought of death as not biological, but as like kind of like this like social metamorphosis, where it's like it's another step in your life, right? It's like for example, the concept of reincarnation. You die, then you turn into something else, right? So it's like another step. So he thinks that a lot of these societies didn't fear death or securitize against it, right? Baudrillard thinks that the process of securitization against death is problematic because once we start viewing that life is finite, and once we start thinking that there's no afterlife, or there's nothing after that happens this because death is biological, we start trying to like basically create this artificial afterlife where it's like, I can't live forever, but what I can do is try to accumulate as much wealth as possible to pretend that there's an afterlife, right? So he thinks that this is where the concept of production comes from, and this is where the concept of capitalism writ large comes from. He thinks that capitalism is an attempt to exclude death, right? Basically create an artificial life, afterlife. And so that's where he thinks that capitalism came from. He also thinks that the way that the West kind of theorizes about death and securitizes it is the reason why we're so scared of like societies that are different from us. And this is where his concept of radical alterity comes from. Radical alterity basically just meaning like something that's just drastically different from us in terms of culture or in terms of like subjectivities, et cetera, et cetera. So since we don't understand things like Islam, we can never understand things like Islam as the perspective of a Western government. What we do is we try to we think of them as closer and closer to death. And as a result, we try to like preemptively destroy them, right? If we didn't have this kind of securitization against death, then arguably we would not have this kind of same like response to things that are different from us, because we're not scared that they could potentially kill us because we're not scared of death, right? This is also like Bataille writes about this a lot. The concept of death actually like kind of like pops up a lot in postmodernism. Another thing is like Baudrillard thinks that like the way that the West threatens death kind of puts like us in like a social death where it's like where we're constantly have to being scared of like nuclear war. This was more in the context of like the 1980s, I guess, where like the threat of nuclear war was a lot bigger than like what we think it is now. Like even if we think like even if we won the Indo-Pac gap, like none of us are really like scared of nuke war happening, right? But this was the 80s, right? This was like the time where both the USSR and both the United States were like accumulating massive nuclear weapons, and like nuclear war could have happened at any given moment. So Baudrillard thinks like this threat of death that the United States pushes upon people kind of puts us in a like social death where we're scared to do anything because we're constantly scared of death. It's almost like I don't know, like you're planning to ask someone out on a date, and like there's the constant threat of rejection, so you just never do it, right? Baudrillard thinks that like once we stop securitizing against death and risk, then we can truly live like you're not, once you're like not scared of like getting rejected by someone, like maybe you can finally ask them out, you know? So that's like the kind of like concept of like the fear of death and like where all of these things come from. General exchange overcomes generous exchange overcomes reciprocal exchange. I think that Riffic, that generous exchange is kind of like similar to reciprocal exchange in that like both are not based off accumulation. Once you're not trying to like produce as much wealth as possible, then you can like give someone like as many gifts as possible, right? Like that's like a simple example, right? Is Baudrillard a postmodernist? Baudrillard is a postmodernist in the sense that like you have to understand like postmodernism is a very broad kind of like vacuous term. Like it describes everything from like South Park, the TV show, to like the UK version of The Office, to like random pieces of art. But the ultimate like kind of like unifying thing of postmodernism in terms of philosophy, literature, and art is that it doesn't believe in absolute truth, and it doesn't believe in objective truth, and it tries to subvert the authority of these kind of forms of objective truth through things like irony, through things like satire, etc., etc. A fun fact: this is why like so many like TV shows like after the postmodernist movement happened were so cynical and so kind of like absurdist in a sense. Like if you've ever seen Seinfeld, it's just like almost complete absurdism and irony at any given moment. Same with South Park and all these like different TV shows. But we're actually like kind of like going into like a postmodernist age where it's like we realize that like this kind of absurdity and irony is like not that like helpful for lives, and it just makes us cynical. So that's why things like the first like kind of response to postmodernism is like kind of like the United States version of The Office, where it's like things are like sappy, but like we find value in that sappy. Like it's okay to be sappy. You don't have to be like critical of everything at any given time, which is different from the UK version, which is just like complete darkness and sadness. But anyways, so yes, Baudrillard is technically grouped under postmodernism in that he kind of criticizes the West, the way that the West has like imposed objective truth upon other regions. But like it's almost like a vacuous term in that like that Baudrillard is very different from Deleuze, who's very different from Foucault, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so like he is a postmodernist, but like the term doesn't mean too much. Does anyone have any more questions? I can talk about like how to respond to like a Baudrillard KF if y'all want. I can stay for like 10 minutes more. Okay, sure. Okay, so a Baudrillard KF. First, like I'll talk about framework first. Framework makes the game work. Against like you will know that Baudrillard KFs, they're not gonna go for like a counter interpretation, right? They're not gonna go for like trying to solve limits, right? They're just gonna impact turn limits because debate is bad, because policy debate is bad, more specifically, right? So they're gonna say limits leads to worse people because it sustains debate's mode of transparency, right? So knowing this, you know that if you go for a skills argument, okay, like I like to think of framework in like three different ways. Like there's the kind of like framework that's like fairness. Fairness is the only thing that matters. Second is like skills. Like fairness is good because it leads us to be like better advocates of the world, right? There's this third framework argument, like research is good because like fairness is good because like fairness is good, but also fairness is good because it leads us to develop critical thinking skills that helps us better understand the app, right? So I'll go over all three. If you go for the skills argument on framework, it becomes kind of iffy because you still have because at that point, this is all my opinion also. At that point, you have to defend, but like I guess this opinion is also kind of like fostered by like people on debate drills and stuff. If you go for the skills argument on framework, you have to put a lot of defense to their theory because you're basically saying debate leads us to be activists, but Baudrillard says that activism is bad, so they can impact turn that, right? So you have to think about it as putting impact defense on their F and being like activism is good, right? Like debate leads us to be good people, right? So you still have to beat back their theory of power, right? Fairness is kind of like the hard, like think of it as like the hard Republican stance. That's like debate is a game, like it doesn't like change us as people. We can advocate for different things, but it doesn't mean that we're going to believe in like Western imperialism or we don't become George Bush by advocating for like US primacy. Like it's just a game. Like we don't care about like it has no exterior consequences, right? Like, and then there's this like card called Bjork. Let me type that in. That like got very popularized recently against Baudrillard Fs. Bjork basically says that like pretending that like a game has exterior meaning gives legitimacy to the game. So if a Baudrillard debater like really wants to like destroy the game, they need to pretend that it has no outside meaning. So if the Baudrillard debater is like, yeah, debate has this like epic ability to change us as people, then you're giving legitimacy to the game, right? But if we pretend like there's just no meaning to debate, like we just do it for fun, like we just do it for the sake of doing debate and we enjoy it, then it's like, then you can like start delegitimizing debate. It's like, whoa, this is kind of meaningless, all of this stuff, right? I would be careful with the fairness and Bjork stuff because a lot of judges just don't like this argument. Yeah, a lot of judges just don't like hard fairness because they think that fairness is an internal link. But if you have a judge like, I don't know, like someone who's like super policy, like by all means go for this argument. Like it'll just like also like it just like kind of tears Baudrillard debaters up. The third approach is and like obviously then you just have like your reasons why fairness matters. Like fairness matters because every argument accedes to the value of fairness. Fairness matters because we all enjoy debate, but debate doesn't become enjoyable when one side's always winning, et cetera, et cetera. The third approach is kind of like a middle ground of the two, the research skills. You can make an argument that like debate doesn't like train us to like I'll do that in a bit. Debate doesn't train us to like believe in one thing or another. Like I don't know. At my camp tourney, like I read U.S. primacy good every single round on the app, and like I do not believe that U.S. primacy is good by any means. I probably think it's necessary, but like that's a different topic. But like debate doesn't lead us to believe in any arguments, but what debate does is it fosters skills, like critical thinking skills that can help us understand the world. And as a result, these kind of critical thinking skills can also help us understand things like Baudrillard. It can help us understand things like US imperialism, et cetera, et cetera. So at this point, you're not impact turning the F, right? With like kind of like the activism good stuff, you're link turning the F, being like, yes, your skills matter. Definitely the skills about being anti-imperialist. These things are all worth talking about, but the only way that we can actualize it is by generating smart people who are able to be critical thinking. And the only way that critical thinking skills happen is by having equal sides where we both contest one another and research the arguments. If there's no incentive to research Baudrillard, then no one's ever going to learn about Baudrillard, because if there's no fairness, then one side's going to win. And like make an argument that's like, yeah, debate can be more than just like a game, but like at the heart of the level is like we kind of like do debate because we want to win at some level. We obviously care about other things, but like there's at some level competition matters, right? So that's like the framework approach. The CapK approach is like, it's like pretty good. I think it's better than most people give it credit for. I think you just need to make, like, it depends on like you winning arguments that like activism and progress are possible. It's basically like, kind of think about like the Baudrillard F as like a Wilderson F that's like progress isn't possible and capitalism will always be sustained except for like massive things like terrorism and like et cetera, et cetera. But like on the CapK, you can be like Baudrillard's rejection of politics sustains capitalism and keeps it alive, and then when that like activism is possible, right? So I think it's just like a two-found thing. Like, I think if you look at like Rex's wiki or something, like you'll see like this one card that's like pretty good. That's like Baudrillard's nihilistic understanding of politics just reifies the system of capitalism. And like at that point, like you could just win like extinction outweighs with like the Palmer 15 card. And then like capitalism, like yes, and then like you can go like the middle ground approach. Like capitalism operates semiotically, but like to some extent, capitalism still operates on a material level. Like it still affects like millions and millions of like workshop, like child workshop workers in China, right? Because they're still producing something. It's not just semiotic, right? So like finding those kind of things do matter. Okay. So I think that's like fairness or framework cap. Like you can go for things like Secol. You can go for things like Afropest. Afropest, you would have to be careful because like they can like if you ever saw Ronik's round versus Mahir, Mahir read Afropest and like Ronik just changed their af. So Mahir said debate is like good, thinking that Ronik would be like debate is bad. Mahir said debate is good because it leads to like scholarship between like Afropest scholars, like for example, like Wilderson versus Sharp or like Wilderson versus Warren or like all these like different debates. But then Ronik was like, yeah, we agree debate is good. We just have an alternative understanding of debate. But like in another instance, if Mahir read debate is bad in the 1 and C, then like Ronik could be like, debate is bad. We agree permutation, right? So you have to be careful. And like when you're going for these Ks against Baudrillard Fs, like you need to like press them and cross-X what they actually defend. Because as Scotty P once said in like in a high school impact podcast I listened to, or like someone did, there's like two types of K debaters, like cheaters and like people who actually care about their argument. Like, let's be honest, like Baudrillard debaters tend to be more on the cheating side than caring really about like simulation and like the way that like debate produces Karl Rove, you know? So they're going to be much more like, it's going to be much more harder to win a link into the K. Okay, let me continue. How do you respond to like debate as a game? We need fairness to debate. So I think you need to make arguments that debate does. So like obviously like every single like good framework debater will make the argument that debate doesn't alter our subjectivity, but you need to answer, well, if you're running Baudrillard on the app, you need to make the alternative argument that debate does alter our subjectivity. Like think about how many lawyers come out of debate, how many policymakers come out of debate, how many activists come out of debate. Like to some extent, debate does influence the way we're thinking. Like think about how like debate's like 99.9% liberal, except for like some people I won't name. But like obviously debate does affect the way we think to some degree, right? Or liberal or like even more left. But and then you can make the counter argument that if we prove that fairness leads to something and that something is bad because it produces knowledge and knowledge is bad, then you can impact turn that, right? Ria, my AF this year was just like based off the kind of like elimination of like alterity and like elimination of death, and like it analyzes how like the Bishop card analyzes how like the Iraq War was an instance in which we try to eliminate like the Middle East before it could eliminate us, and that's basically what it says. Like the way that the United States threatens death is kind of leads to like this cleansing of the world of like all things closer to death. Let's see. What are cross-ex questions to ask Baudrillard nerds? Yeah. Oh, I think one of the smartest arguments you can make against Baudrillard if you're running framework, which like I know some of y'all don't like framework, but like I think that framework is probably necessary against Baudrillard apps because Baudrillard apps are like so shifty that like they can just be like no link permutation to the K, not my Baudrillard, right? And it's going to be very hard to come back with it in the 2NR. So read a framework argument, just like put framework in there, even if you're not going to read it, and be like, so that you can like have an option in the 2NR, because you know they're going to link to like framework every single time. They can't be we, me, or I guess they can, but like no one ever buys that, right? So, so Riffic, going on to your question, this is just kind of like a preload. I think a good argument you can make against Baudrillard is, as Patrick said, the Pollard 14 evidence is like the solvency for most debaters. It's like we need to like conform to the system in some extent so that the system doesn't just immediately kick us out, so that we can subvert the system. In context of debate, if someone were to just like straight up like cheat, right? If someone were to straight up just like have a 15-minute 1AC, like sure, like you'll probably subvert debate, but they'll be kicked out, right? So that's what Paula is saying. Like the system, if you think of debate as the system, would just kick you out if you just have an exterior critique and you just try to like not conform to it. So you need to conform to it to an extent so that you can subvert it, so that you can be like a Trojan horse within debate, right? So then knowing this, like first, Riffic, you can ask questions like, I actually asked these like same questions to like Dylan Burke this year at presentation, but like first you can ask questions like, because you know they're gonna say debate is bad. Like why is clipping bad? Why can I not give a 15-minute 1NC, right? Then you need to ask yourselves like, then they'll probably be like, well, our Pollard 14 evidence says that exterior critiques of the system only get kicked out, and they're like super nerdy Baudrillard voice, you know? And then you should ask yourself, like, then you should ask, like, why do you disclose? Like, why do you spread? Like, these aren't rules. Like, these are like things that are negotiated by debaters and you still follow them. And likewise, why can't you read a plan and subvert the system, right? Like, there's nothing intrinsic to reading a plan that's like, it'll lead to genocide. You can read a plan and subvert the system, which is like a really convincing TVA argument I think you can make. But second is, I think you can make arguments, like if you're gonna go for the K, like Afropess against Baudrillard, point them down on like what their position is. Be like, is debate reclaimable? Yes or no? If they're super shifty about this, then like maybe you can make it into like an own link, being like, this is how whiteness like kind of like shifts away from like conversations about blackness and kind of like protects itself by being super shifty and fluid, right? Then you can make arguments that are like, if they say debate is bad, then you can make arguments that are like debate is good for Afro-pessimist scholar or like secular scholarship, right? If they say debate is bad or debate can be good, but like our system like kind of subverts it to be good, then you can make arguments like debate is fundamentally like bad because it's so colonialist, which is a critique, a link into the alternative, or not the alternative, the K. So like, I think one is like, I think if you're gonna go for K, you can like make an argument that like a fluidity argument that like their shiftiness is a link into the K if they're shifty. But if they like kind of like say yes or no or like are not shifty, then like you can kind of pin them down and like take your direction of the K, right? Okay, so Riffic, you've heard the thing that's like we follow procedures, not rules. Or no, there's a difference between procedures and rules, right? And and you've heard the thing that's like form versus content, right? So form is obviously like things like debate rules, like speech times, like not clipping cards, et cetera, like these are like rules that you have to follow, right? And Baudrillard debaters will say that that's different from topicality. That topicality is not a rule, it's a procedure that's able to be negotiated, and it's not like this like capital like R rule, right? So then you can make arguments. So that's your justification for not following the topic, right? And justification for why clipping is bad, because it's a rule and it's not a procedure, right? So likewise, you can make arguments that no, like you still follow the content of debate. You still follow the procedures of debate because you disclose, you spread, you like highlight cards in like verbatim, like which shows how like you're still complicit within debate, right? And then you can make arguments that like there's nothing radical about your affirmative because like you're still following like every single procedure of debate. Like what the heck is radical about like you like spreading 6 minutes like sounding constipated about like communication? Like there's nothing radical about it because you still follow debate to like a T. Does that make sense, Rudvik? It shows how it's like a TVA argument. It's like it shows how they can still be a Trojan horse in debate by reading a plan. Yeah, good. Nathan, let's have this be the last question, and then we can wrap up. And then I'll send the reading list later. But thoughts on a Baudrillard cap-AF, the first 2 chapters of. Would this AF be topical or non-topical? Topical? It would have to depend on the topic, obviously. I would think. I'm trying to think of a topic where this could be applicable. Like I guess. I think the problem is that any kind of political advocacy that a Baudrillard AF would say on topic, like a topical Baudrillard AF, would kind of be a double turn because Baudrillard would probably criticize it. Let's see, sanctions. I mean, United States. I don't think like a Baudrillard cap-AF would be as useful as like a Baudrillard like a K criticizing like international relations and like death, right? Like I don't. Like I feel like Baudrillard's theory of deterrence would be a lot more applicable on the kind of sanctions topic and IR topics than like a cap-AF, right? I think non-topically, yeah, I'm having trouble like visualizing what a Baudrillard cap-AF would look like. True. I think there's arguments to be made. Like I was thinking about this, and like I was thinking about how like Baudrillard debaters have not like advanced framework and framed their framework answers in like the past 5 years, and it's just like the same thing. And I was thinking there's like arguments to be made about how how the system, or like for example on the criminal justice system, like the criminal justice topic, you can make an argument that like the criminal justice system is like an illusion, and like buying into this illusion only like recrafts its legitimacy. So then I guess you can make answers against framework that are like your model of debate just like re-legitimizes the criminal justice system by like thinking that it's like real and like on the terrain of the material rather than the semiotic, and then have like a counter interp that's like affirm like I don't know, like a philosophical affirmation of the topic or something like that. Like I think that's one way you can do it. I think that's one way you can do it so that it's not just a debate bad K. Yeah. The problem with like Baudrillard is that like it's hard to craft like counter interps and like debate bad because Baudrillard's or something that's not debate bad because like the Baudrillard AFs are so totalizing. Like they're making a claim about communication writ large, and it's like really hard to generate something that's like not based off communication, you know? I think you can make an argument about how like debates like their attempts to like I think I'll have to think about them more, but I think that there could be an argument about like capitalism is the like the cause of their affirmative, and like the affirmative investment within politics within the larger system only legitimizes it more, and then like use that as a link argument about how capitalism doesn't like their view of capitalism as something operating on the material only recreates the kind of arguments that they're criticizing, and then make an argument like the counter argument that's like capitalism is semiotic, not material, right? But then it kind of have to be like a cap K where it's like you have to explain why capitalism like kind of creates the problems that they're criticizing. Okay, last question. The argument about contradictions. Yeah. So Rafik, like Baudrillard teams all the time are like our proliferation of irony, our proliferation of subversion, our criticism, our absurdist criticisms of debate, are the insertion of meaningless signs into debate's capitalist exchange of information, so that it kind of like basically it makes fun of debate to subvert its own legitimacy, right? And yeah, that's their argument is like that's why we should follow debates like procedures, because if we just follow debates rules, then we'd just be literally kicked out. Okay. Is Patrick still here? Wait, Patrick. If Patrick is here, I wanted him to explain the presumption trigger thing. I guess they're not responsive right now. Okay, Ria, I think you should ask Patrick on the chat, and I'm sure Patrick would explain to you. Okay. All right, sounds good. Thank you everyone for joining. This was a lot of fun, and I hope y'all are either successful reading Baudrillard or answering Baudrillard next year. All right, I'll see y'all.